Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. My name is Almira Tanner. My pronouns are she, her. And yeah, where to start? A little bit about me. I guess originally I am from Canada. I grew up in Vancouver, which is in British Columbia, and now I live in Berkeley, California. But feel like my growing up childhood was pretty ordinary, nothing too interesting to share there other than I always kind of loved animals as a kid. And growing up, one of my best friends in elementary school was just being raised vegetarian by her mom. Like that's just kind of how she was raised. And she really was the one who kind of pushed me to think about why, like, why would you eat animals if you love them so much? And so that's kind of like where my journey towards animal rights activism started. But I will probably get into that a little bit more in detail in the future. But other basic things about me, went to school in Canada, studied biomedical physiology and kinesiology, and then got my license to practice occupational therapy, which is what I was doing before I moved to the United States and kind of became a full-time animal rights activist. So now I lead Direct Action Everywhere, which is a global network of grassroots animal rights activists. And that is almost all of what I do for every day of my life now. But other things I like doing are running, going to concerts when there's not a pandemic, and drinking lots of coffee. So that's a little bit about me. But yeah, if you have like, maybe we can talk a little bit more about the animal rights journey if that's one of your questions, because I feel like I could
So
go
how
on.
did you get involved with the DXC and like your position in it, and how did the organization start?
Yeah, so I didn't found DXE. It started without me, and I was still in Vancouver at the time, and folks in the Bay Area in California around 2012 basically started talking to each other, saying like, there's something missing in the animal rights movement, at least in the United States. I think there had been a long history of direct action in the animal rights movement before, but because of super repressive laws like the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, and people just got a little freaked out, and a lot of the movement that was doing direct action essentially stopped. And so folks like Wayne Shang and Cristobal Van Breen and Ronnie Rose were getting together, figuring out like, what do we want to do to fill this void? And they started Direct Action Everywhere essentially in 2013. At the time I was in Vancouver, and Direct Action Everywhere, when it started, kind of wanted to create these chapters in other places. And one of the places was Vancouver. And they reached out to someone at the time who I didn't know, and asked them to start doing some actions in Vancouver. And so that's kind of how I ended up at a DXC protest, and kind of went from there, basically attended some protests in Vancouver every month or so, and eventually made my way to the first ever conference that DXC hosted in California, which was in 2014. And I went there and I was just like mind blown. It was so amazing. I had never been surrounded by so many animal rights activists before, and there was like 50 people there. It was not that impressive, but at that time I was like, wow. And that's really when I thought, okay, this is what I want to do. I really want to get more involved, started organizing, and then eventually a couple of years later, moved to California and progressively got more and more involved. I think a lot of people know Wayne Shang, who is one of the founders of DXC and previously held the role that I have now, for various reasons, just that he'd been in leadership for a long time. He's facing a ton of felony charges for helping animals. He decided that he wanted to take a little bit of a step back. And that's when I kind of took up the mantle. Interesting note though about DXC in the Bay Area is we do have elections. So I did eventually like run to be this position and got elected. So there's a little bit of a democracy in my position too. I shouldn't say a little bit. It is democratic how people find themselves in these roles.
So that's a little bit how it works in DXC. It's democratic, and like, can you tell us a little bit more how DXC works? Like the story, or how do they? What goals do they have? Do they have a plan? achieve it, or future goals?
Yeah, so our mission at DXC is to create revolutionary social and political change for animals in one generation. And what we mean by that is we want to change the way that the law and the legal system views other animals so that they're not considered property, or there's actually laws to protect them. That's kind of like the political change. We also want to change the way society as a whole views animals, like changing the social norms around our interactions and our perceptions of other animals. And we want to do that in one generation, one human generation. So we do have a roadmap, which is kind of like our basic timeline of our vision of how we see this happening, which ends in 2040. That's our goal. And what we envision at the end of this roadmap at 2040 is something that we kind of call Rose's Law, which is an animal bill of rights. And of course, when it comes time to writing Rose's Law, it's going to be very legal jargon and stuff. But the basic premise would be that all animals are considered persons and not property, that they're not like owned by people. Maybe they have guardians, or maybe they're wild, they're not killed or exploited by humans. And they have a protected home and habitat. It's like some basic tenets that we're hoping for all animals. And so that's kind of like the trajectory. And then we have like increments of how we're going to get there. Currently, and one thing I guess I'll say is that the way that we see this change happening is not by changing each individual person one by one to go vegan. Personally, I think that's like a losing battle. The population is growing faster than we can change people's diets. And especially in the United States, the way that the animal agriculture industry is so heavily subsidized by the government, our consumer choices don't actually really have that big of an impact on the actual animal agriculture industry. I think being vegan is a really important symbolic gesture, in the sense of saying I don't want to participate in this horrible system of violence. I don't eat animals. I never will see myself eating animals. But at the same time, I don't think that's the way we're going to achieve this change. And so a lot of our goals are focused on just creating changes in social norms, as well as policy and law, and fighting these battles in courts. So specifically, right now, a couple of the campaigns we're working on statewide in California, we're working on a moratorium that would prevent the construction and expansion of new factory farms and slaughterhouses in the state. So we see a vision of all of these slaughterhouses and factory farms shutting down. And the first step is at least not building new ones. And then locally in Berkeley, we are working on getting the city government to not spend their money, our tax dollars, on animal products. So most city governments purchase food, and we think that that's a really important and symbolic way for a government to say, this industry is toxic, we don't want anything to do with them, and we are not going to spend our money on animal products. So that's a very small
That's really,
I guess microcosm of the bigger
sorry
picture.
if I'm interrupting, but
no, go for it, because I'll
really
talk
awesome
all day.
Because we had something similar in Sweden. It's like a campaign, or we just organized without organization, just okay, let's ask the different municipalities or governments authorities to start having a vegan milk alternative, or as a standard, and so they all just buy it in and then use it, and that's a rule, and it passed. So we actually have went a step forward.
That's awesome.
In that area, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very similar, and so I thought about this, the felony charges, and because if you save a human, then you're a hero, but if you save an animal, you're the villain, depending on the species.
Mm-hmm.
And most activists don't do illegal stuff. They don't want to get out of their comfort zone, and don't want to sacrifice their normal life, and all of a sudden become getting legal charges. So how do you build up the courage, or realize that this is what I have to do, because nobody else is going to save this animal, so I have to. What's going on in your mind when you're in that moment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll say one thing as a little bit of a caveat first is I think a lot of people, or I've heard from people that say, like, oh, I really love DXC and I want to get involved, but I can't go to jail, so I don't want to get involved. And then I'm always like, no, like not everyone is getting arrested all the time, and the majority of the people in our community are not going to court and stuff. So I think this is, but at the same time, this is these legal cases, these arrests, these prosecutions are not just like an unfortunate byproduct of our actions, they're actually very crucial to our strategy. And if you look back at social movements, other successful social justice movements, they very effectively used repression to gain sympathy. So for example, like one image in my mind that I see a lot is like in the civil rights movement, and there's like children who are marching, and the police are basically like blasting them with fire hoses. And like, so these kids, you're like, why would they do that? Why would they put themselves in harm's way? Like, that's horrible. These are just children and they're being like abused by these cops. But that moment was so powerful because the public saw that and they were like, okay, of course not everyone changed their mind, but a lot of people decided like, I can't be neutral in this situation anymore. I need to side with these activists because I don't want to side with the people who are like blasting children with fire hoses. Now, I think our situation is in a sense a little bit different, but the same premise of like using repression to elevate an issue, gain attention, and gain sympathy from people is really important. So that's a bit why we take actions that involve sacrifice. There's a lot of different types of sacrifice that people do. Like I walked 150 miles in like 6.5 days and didn't get arrested, but I think people were like, oh my God, you walked to Sacramento from San Francisco? And I was like, yeah, we did it. And it was really difficult, but showing that you are willing to put your body on the line for this cause makes people understand that it's really important. But from the specific legal perspective, getting these cases into court is how we're going to change the law. Like we might lose a bunch of them, but eventually one of them we are going to win, and that's going to set a really important precedent. And if you look back at the anti-slavery movement, like this was a lot of their strategy. They would try to go to court and make these arguments as why the slaves should be free and why they shouldn't be considered property. And they lost some, but then they did win some, and that set these really important precedents. And so if we can go to court and say, you know what? Yeah, we went to this farm and we took a chicken and we took that chicken out of the farm to the vet, but that's not considered stealing because that chicken's not property. If we win that case, like, that's a really, really important precedent that we can say animals aren't property, they are individuals, like you said, in the same way that if I ran into a house that was on fire and rescued you from that house, I wouldn't be thrown in jail for stealing. It would be like, wow, thank you so much for doing that. So that's a bit why we do it. And to your question about like what's going on in my mind, I think understanding the importance of sacrifice and the importance of these cases really helps you prepare for like why you're going to do that. But also knowing that there's just so many people who are in the community ready to support. Like I wouldn't do this if it was just me, because then I would go to jail and nobody would notice and nobody would be there to support and nobody would be there to like amplify that message. So having all these people who are going to like call the district attorney and tell them to drop the charges, come to the courthouse and sit there and show their support. And if we do go to jail, which I think some people certainly will in this movement, those people are going to be there to like make sure that the whole world hears that story. Because I think even people who are not totally animal rights activists, if you're like, hey, I might go to jail or I might go to prison for 10 years for saving a chicken from a farm who was going to die, they're like, that's ridiculous, So I think it's an opportunity to get the message out there, but only if we have the community. So knowing why you're doing it and having the community support, I think, is the most important thing. But also understand that that's not like that everyone has to do that. That's some people's role, but it's not like everybody needs to go to jail, because we need people out there who are not in jail making sure that we're still continuing to take action. So that's a bit of a long-winded answer to that question.
So what's your personal story when it comes to activism and getting involved with the animal rights? How did you, break the normal pattern that we all grew up with, eating meat and all that. How did you become vegan? And
Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, went vegetarian around 10 years old, mostly because my friend bluntly told me, like, why are you eating animals if you love them so much? I didn't really know anything about the dairy and egg industries. Like I'm sure I was probably still wearing leather. Like I think I just stopped eating animals. And that was from 10 until 23 years old. And so in 2010, when I was 23, I kind of started doing some research on dairy. Like I just wasn't like feeling very well in general, and was like, healthy food, and then started kind of realizing, oh, dairy is not meant for humans. And then that kind of led me down the path of dairy is also like horrible for cows. And here I am, an ethical vegetarian, but actually like dairy, and then then you go down the rabbit hole of eggs, and all these things are causing so much suffering. And so I kind of was like, ugh, but I love pizza, the annoying excuses. But anyway, so then eventually a couple months later, I went vegan. Literally didn't know anyone who was vegan. The only person I knew who was vegan was an acquaintance of mine's ex-boyfriend, who I had one interaction with on like Facebook Messenger. And so I was kind of like searching for vegan community, and found some people in Vancouver, but then I went to grad school and again kind of had little vegan community there, but not much. Maybe went to a couple protests, but it wasn't until I graduated, came back to Vancouver, and kind of was like, all right, my life is starting. I'm finally done with school. I have like a couple months before I have a job. I just graduated, trying to find my job in my new career, have a couple months. What's going on? And I don't know if you all know the Save movement, which is like a group of activists that go to slaughterhouses and bear witness and document what's happening to the animals as they go to slaughter. They basically had just started expanding out of Toronto, and there was this one woman who was like starting these vigils in Vancouver at the slaughterhouse. And it was like 7:00 in the morning on a Friday, but I didn't have a job. So I was like, I'll go. And so that's kind of where I started really doing regular activism. And from that, I met people, and then eventually Dxc stuff, and then the rest is history. So that's kind of the trajectory of that. And it's just interesting that, I went vegan in 2010, but didn't really start doing any activism for like 3 years at least. And in those first 3 years, like I was just really angry at my family and trying to get people to change their diets, and like no one was listening to me, and like maybe they were a little bit, but like it wasn't really effective. And it was when I started doing activism that, like, for one, I think the activism was effective, but that's actually when people in my life started to change and take me seriously, because I think they realized, oh, she's not just like, sitting at home typing angrily on Facebook about it. Like she's actually out there doing something.
It's not just a period. It's not a trend.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
How do you say? Yeah. Sorry
like
if I'm using
a phase.
Phase. Sorry, it's in Swedish words. It's
no, for sure. And just like kind of putting your money where your mouth is or something is another expression of.
So what took the, like, what changed you to go from vegan to actually becoming an activist?
I think, I just realized that I cared about this issue, and just being grumpy about it and not doing anything at home wasn't really helping. And then there's this opportunity to speak up and protest, and then also meet other people that cared. Like that's kind of how that started. And I think I've always kind of been someone who, for lack of a better word, like bossing people around and like organizing things, and want to, like, I don't know, just do things. I've always been kind of that person. And so I think it kind of fit with my personality to start organizing and, being loud on a megaphone. That wasn't a totally foreign concept to me. So yeah. And then just seeing, like, feeling inspired, I think is what really kind of changed from this is a thing I do a little bit on the side to I really want to do this with my entire life, was just hearing that like Dxc had a plan. Like it wasn't like we're just going to try and we don't really know, but it's like, here's the evidence that this has worked in other movements. Here's our best attempt at what this roadmap is going to look like. We have social scientists on our side. like, we're not, like all these things like made me feel like, oh, these people really thought about this, and it seems possible to me. And that was just really mind-blowing. I've never heard anyone talk about animal rights like that. And that's kind of when I think a lot of my perception shifted towards seeing this not as just like a side hobby, but as something I was going to do with the majority of my life.
It's like a good tactic in DXC. It feels almost like they have a plan, a method, and they analyze other organizations, and they're fairly new, so they know what works and doesn't, and they just, okay, this is our concept, and then they do it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and we might be wrong. Like, this is our best attempt, and then we're always changing it. I mean, like, we're always changing, like, oh, maybe this tactic or that tactic. But I think just understanding like animal rights is not that different from other social movements. Like, there's unique things about it, but it is a social movement. And so I think in the animal rights movement, sometimes we just like treat it as so different from every other social movement, when it's like, no, this is just another thing where we're fighting against oppression and fighting for justice, like Black Lives Matter, like the marriage equality movement, like women's suffrage, like all of those things. Like, why would we not do the same things that those people did? And because they succeeded. I think sometimes people think of it as more of just like a consumer choice movement.
So you're the organizer in San Francisco for DXC, right?
Yeah.
So how is the animal rights activism in San Francisco compared to other cities you lived in or visited?
Well, I haven't lived in any other places in the United States. I think San Francisco, or technically I'm in Berkeley, but for anyone who's not in the Bay Area, it's all kind of the same. Everyone knows San Francisco, but it's pretty close. San Francisco and Berkeley has like a huge history of being on the forefront of a lot of these issues. So it's usually like one of the first places to take up a new social issue, especially UC Berkeley, which is, a school here, part of the same UC system that you all are in. So I think this is a really good place to try to start a movement. And the reason I say that is because our strategy and our theory of change, like how we envision this change happening, is that it's going to start in one place and then it's going to spread to other places. That's a little different than when we started DXC. And when we started DXC, we thought there's going to be all these chapters everywhere and they're all going to do things, and then eventually everything's going to change. And we talked to people in other movements and they're like, no, that's not how that happens. You go to one place or a couple places and you concentrate and you do you have a lot of people in one place, because that's what you're going to need is a critical mass, and then that changes and then it spreads, and then maybe then you have to move and go, but it really needs to concentrate in one place. And so I think that's like a really good place for this to happen. That being said, there's other, I think, progressive hubs in the United States that have the potential to kind of launch little movements. Like maybe, I know Massachusetts, that area has kind of seen a lot of movement start there. Maybe like some kind of like, I don't know, like you have these progressive strongholds like Austin in Texas. Like Texas is super conservative, but like Austin isn't. But mostly I see the Bay Area as a place to really start these movements. So that's why I think we have more of an emphasis here, and why activism here feels a little bit different. I will say other countries, I think, have their place too. Like I'm sure in Sweden there's one city or one town that's like, oh, they're always the first people to let the women vote or allow marriage equality or all of those things. In Canada, Vancouver's pretty progressive, so I kind of feel like I just moved from one progressive hub to another. But yeah.
So how are the states in America compared to each other when it comes to like vegan community, animal rights, vegan restaurants, compared to California? Because what I understand, that's the best place to be for a vegan.
Maybe. I don't know about restaurants very much. Yeah, I don't know. Honestly, like I've lived in the States for about 5 years and only really been in California, so I can't say too much, but I know incredible activists all across the country, and I do know that they work, like, you know, they organize in much harder climates, in the sense of like the people in the areas are much more hostile, less open to animal rights, but sometimes I will say that can work in your favor. So I'll just give one example. Iowa. We did a lot of work in Iowa last year. For folks who are listening to this who are not in the US, Iowa is like a huge animal ag state. Pig farming is what Iowa does. It's like pigs and corn, I think. And so like as a whole, there's less people who support animal rights in Iowa than there is in California. But there's also a lot more people who have direct experience with like living beside a factory farm and how horrible that is and how it smells and how it destroys communities. And it's an issue that's just so much more on the forefront of people's minds, which means that like basically anything we did in Iowa, the press covered it. It was always in the media. Versus California, most people have other priorities. They're not thinking about it. They don't live beside a pig farm. Their dad's not a pig farmer. Like they don't have these debates with their families. So in some ways, I think, even though maybe the different states are not as supportive from a population base as California, there's benefits to like going and kind of doing stuff in them, because it's just, there's so much polarization. Everyone pays attention to that. But yeah, I don't really know exactly like the restaurant scene and all these other places, but I feel like it's pretty good. There's vegan restaurants everywhere.
Nice. So has anyone particular like inspired you in the animal liberation advocacy?
Oh, like so many people. I will say like the first person that kind of was just like blew my mind was when Wayne, who co-founded Dxc, started just like talking about the strategy. And that really was just like I said earlier, the first time I'd heard that someone actually had a plan that made sense, that was based on evidence of how to make this happen. So I think that's probably like one of my like initial inspirations. But now like I just feel so privileged to organize with people who are just like amazing people. Like we like sometimes, you know, we have to do an action and we're like, you know, this could be like a scary action. You could get arrested, you could face restitution, and people are just like, yeah, I'll do it. Like, I'm down. Or like, who, like, help, there's like an injured pigeon. Like, we need someone to drive at like, you know, in the middle of the night to go help this animal. And like, people are just volunteering. So just like, I don't know, I just, being involved in this community and organizing has just like made me see that, because sometimes it's really easy to get cynical, like, oh, humans suck, right? But then I work in this community. Sometimes it's really hard and there's conflict and it's frustrating, but for the most part, I'm just like, wow, like people are good and people want to do good if they're given the opportunity. So I don't know, like that's a generic answer, but I'm just like really, really amazed by some of the people in our community, most of the people in our community that I get to work with every day. Yeah.
So like many people might think about veganism as some kind of a Hollywood trend for actors, and you know, it's just for health, for you know, like rich people do a diet because they don't want to get cancer, want to live longer, or something like that. And at the same time, it's like it's not just a trend. It's been, you know, going on for a long time. There's people in history that's been involved with trying to, you know, care for animals. And there's this one person, Francis of Assisi, was a monk who was kind of like, if you know, what's it called? Now it's stuck in the head. The Seven Dwarfs and this like
Snow White.
Snow White, yeah.
Yeah.
And she's like singing to the animals, and they're all gathering to her. And this monk, Francis of Assisi, was kind of like that person, but in real life was caring for animals, like there was almost as if he could like speak to them, or that's just the reputation. But and then they named San Francisco after him, and it's like, so I'm just like, okay, so people misunderstand the whole vegan idea a little bit, I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at like indigenous peoples in a lot of communities, like maybe they're not like 100% vegan, but like traditional diets are like some sort of grain and some sort of legume, beans and rice, or like lentils and roti, or like whatever. Like this idea of intensive animal agriculture is I think, a very Western and like colonizer style of feeding people. And it's frustrating, I think, when, especially like people say, oh, like veganism is a white thing, and then that just completely erases all the people of color who are vegan. A lot of people in our community are people of color organizing, and people are like, do I not count? So I think that's like a pretty dangerous myth. But I also think that sometimes part of why that happens is like the animal rights movement has just focused too much on veganism. And so people just conflate animal rights with like eating kale. And we have to just be like, no, like this is not about a diet. This is about, we care about justice for other animals. And right now, I also think there's like just a lot of problems with our food system entirely. Like we need to redo the entire thing, and just focusing so much in on animal rights as whether you're vegan or not, kind of, I think, just perpetuates this idea that it's like, yeah, it's just a diet. It's for like rich people who go shop at Whole Foods, and it's this new thing, versus talking about how we want to live in harmony with other animals, which is not, like you said, not a new concept at all. So yeah, I can imagine that it's really frustrating for people to constantly hear that. I just, even as an example, even recently, we were supporting BOA, which is the UC Berkeley kind of equivalent of you all, doing a protest at Cal Dining, as well as like the kind of Dxc chapter on campus there. And I think someone kind of just said to them like, oh, this is such a privileged issue, like all these white people organizing this protest. And they were like, this protest was organized by people of color, and like we handed out free food to everyone who was at the dining hall, and I think it's used as a distraction. It's used as a tool to say, I don't have to do this because someone, it's a good excuse to not,
it's like people
care
try
about
to
animals.
blame and find the fault in anything, like
Yeah, it's like, well, I don't want to do that, so therefore let me think of some reason to not do it. But I also think like there is so much out there that people see that is reinforcing this idea that it is this like, like you see those white lady with the salad memes, and I think that's what like people think about for veganism, and you're like, I see why people get that idea. So I think two things is like, one, we gotta fight against that, but also like we need to shift the animal rights movement away from just focusing so much on veganism, and that I think will allow way more people to participate, and they'll get there eventually. They'll stop eating animals, but I don't want to use it as like this like gatekeeper for people aligning themselves with the movement.
So like we talked a little bit about how people might try to find the fault, and just saying, oh, you're doing this wrong, and what about this? So is activism draining? Is it like hard to keep going, having the energy to do the fight? Like how do you cope with it?
Sometimes, yes. I think some of the things that are the most draining, and this is not unique to the animal rights movement, is a conflict within the movement and conflict within organizing. There's like some, I don't even know if it's like a misattributed quote, but like MLK, Martin Luther King Jr. saying he spent more of his time dealing with internal conflict than actually fighting for civil rights. So in a sense, that makes me feel better. It's not like the animal rights movement is like horribly flawed and we're the only people who fight with each other. But I think it's a normal part of organizing, but that's exhausting because you're like, oh my God, we can't even get along. And we're like 1% of the population or less than 1%. Like, how are we supposed to unite to take on this huge system. So I think, yeah, that's pretty exhausting. But I think one thing that's important, well, obviously community, like getting that support is important, and having victories is important. And that's challenging because like, you want those victories to be important. Like, I don't really believe strongly in like some of the welfare reforms that people are doing. Like, I think it's good, like people work on their different things, we all have our own things, but like at the same time, it's like it is kind of nice to be able to have some victory. So like thinking like, what can we do that makes us feel like we are like moving closer and closer to our goal, even if they're really small steps? Because if you're just like, the goal is animal liberation, and well, today is another day I didn't achieve it, like that's going to be really depressing. So yeah, finding those victories, getting community support is important. And I know people also say, like spend, like if you have the opportunity, it's a little harder during the pandemic, but going to sanctuaries and spending time with other animals that are not being abused is really important, because we see so much violence a lot, either in person or sharing stuff on social media. It's almost like depersonalizes those animals a little bit, and reminding yourself like, oh no, these are like real individuals that we're fighting for, can really recharge your batteries. But it's not easy. And I guess, yeah, the last thing I'll say is just reminding yourself, like, nobody said this was going to be easy. If it was easy, everyone would be doing it, would be done by now. And just the fact that like we are trying to do something to address this issue is so
Yeah,
much
that's more than
more
other
than
people,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, so it's just
they're
like,
not even vegan and like don't bother,
yeah, so I just kind of remind myself like, well, yeah, nobody said it was going to be easy. So if you feel like you're
Yeah,
struggling and you feel like you're not making progress, that's probably how a lot of people felt in a lot of movements. So
definitely. And the thing you said about conflicts and organizations, we had a lot of that in Sweden, especially in the recent years. And it totally takes the toll of people. Just they're like, no, I don't know if I want to do animal rights anymore. You can hear that here and there. And I'm thinking like, imagine like the meat industry or our opponents, so to speak, just being happy about, oh, they're divided now, it's easier, it's like divide and conquer, now we can just, um, so it's beneficial for them but bad for us, basically.
yeah. Yeah, and sometimes it's intentional. Like, I don't think this is most of the time. Most of the time it's just like activists are really passionate, we care a lot, obviously, and so we fight with each other because that's the type of people we are. And I mean to say like, oh, it's inevitable. I think there's a lot of things we can do, like having good culture and not gossiping, I think is like a huge thing that just like causes so much drama and stuff. But sometimes it is intentional. And what I mean by that is that the industry or the police will send people to infiltrate movements. And the best way to infiltrate and cause a movement to fall apart is by creating conflict. Or sometimes it's like people who are in the movement already, and then they'll get like flipped by the police and then start, and they're basically trying to like create drama. And
What?
we know that this has at least been tried in DXC. We have had an FBI agent try to talk to someone who was working with us and say like, hey, are they like, this is just ridiculous, are they selling like drugs and guns to fund their activism? Like, no, we are not selling guns and drugs to fund our activism, but like try to get this person to like sell us drugs so that like they could then basically like say, look at these criminals and like arrest, like they are trying to infiltrate and destroy our movement. It's been done in I think every movement that has had any sort of size. So
It's so ironic that it's like the police or FBI and they're supposed to, protect the law and the citizens and have morals, and then they're like totally opposite. What?
Yeah, I mean, I think the role of the police and the role of the FBI and all these agencies is to protect the status quo, and not, and our goal is to change the status quo. And try to, and that's not what the police are going to be okay with. They're protecting profits, they're protecting order, and we are creating disorder and hurting corporations' profits. So I don't want to I don't say that to make people paranoid, but I also think it is really important for people who are organizing to be aware of the history of infiltration and know that that is a common tactic used by movements, and why it's really important that we don't don't sell drugs and guns, I don't, or don't,
talking
things
about
like that.
Like cops trying to make conflict, or having problems within organizations. How do you make the environment safe and inclusive for everyone?
Yeah, that is a difficult question and difficult task, especially, like I said, a lot of people, a lot of passion. Right now, a lot of the organizing is happening online because of the pandemic, and we know how online communication can just be such a disaster waiting to happen because people don't see each other's faces and they misinterpret people. So I think a couple of things that I think are in a sense basic but really help is creating this norm of calling people in instead of calling people out. We're not out to destroy people on the internet if they make a little mistake. We talk to people directly. We don't gossip behind people's back. That I think really does help to kind of stop some of the rumors and the conflicts from happening. And then we also have a code of conduct that at the end of the day, sometimes it is actually better to not have more people in the community if they're not able to follow the specific code of conduct, then be we're going to have a lot of people because they can do whatever they want. They're just going to drive other people away. So things like racist or sexist behavior and stuff, people make mistakes and we can call them in on it. But at a point, you need to be this isn't the group for you, because we are trying to create a movement where people do feel welcome, where it's diverse, inclusive, and people can kind of feel like they're not going to be just attacked for being in the group. So code of conduct and
so
enforcing.
It's almost like common sense stuff, just putting it in a text format, these are the rules, so everyone are okay with that.
Yeah, and sometimes I think I'm this is common sense, but it's not sometimes. And
everyone has their own interpretation about that.
And just because you have it doesn't mean it's gonna solve all the conflicts or prevent them from happening. I think this is the hardest part, hands down, this is the hardest part of achieving huge change, is community building and community organizing and getting people to work together. But I also don't know, I don't know of any movements that have done it without this. So it's we have to do it, but it's so hard. It is just so hard to get people to work together in a large group. I don't know. I think that's been shown over and over again. But it's worth it. That's the same thing I told myself. It's difficult, but it's worth it. There's no other way that I can see this happening.
What advice would you give to someone curious about joining the animal rights movement, trying to learn more about animal liberation, get involved with it?
The first thing I say is just do it. I know it's a little nerve-wracking to show up to the first event that maybe you don't know anyone, but I think if everyone who was just out there thinking about that they want to do something just went, our numbers would just explode. I think that's the biggest barrier, is just starting. And it's okay if you don't know what you want to do, or what your skills are, or what type of activism you just start doing it. And that's kind of how I got involved. I didn't go from nothing to organizing stuff. I went and I showed up and I did a lot of different things. So number one advice, show up. That is just so much. What we need is people to show up. And so I think that is something. And then also think about how you can use the skills that you have, the things that you like to do, to support animal rights. Not everybody needs to be at the protests, on the front lines, getting arrested. Like I said, maybe you're someone who is more comfortable behind the scenes. We've got a lot of people working on websites, creating apps, all that kind of stuff. So you can find your niche. But I think sometimes people get too worried about, I don't know what the exact right thing to do is. I don't know what I need to do specifically, and that prevents them from doing anything. So just do it, show up. It'll be, maybe it's a little awkward the first time. You don't know anyone, but it's worth it.
So, I mean, now we have a pandemic, so lots of countries are on lockdown. Israel just stopped being on lockdown, and it's all like we're in different stages. How has the pandemic affected activism in your local organization?
Yeah, the pandemic had a huge impact on DXC because so much of what we focus on is in person. Like I said, my main advice to show up is because like most of what we do is in person. We have community events like in normal times, at least twice a week. There's community gatherings, protests happening at least a couple times a month in person, and that all like the protest stuff has been able to start again, but like for a while, like none of that. Everything was on Zoom, and we're like, how are we going to do this? But we adapted. We did online trainings. We did online stuff. We thought of ways to take action safely. We still did investigations, of course, in like full biosecurity gear, and also started thinking about how can we make the connection between animal agriculture and the risk of pandemics, because this is what everybody's thinking about. And I think everyone's thinking like, please let this never happen again. And it will continue to happen if we continue to, confine animals in these super intensive situations. Like the next pandemic will probably come from a pig or a bird, like a chicken farm, possibly in the US because of the way that they're raised and confined. So yeah, it had a big impact in what we did, but I'm really happy to say I don't think it had an impact on our ability to do stuff. We just had to change course. And I laugh because I'd never lived in a pandemic before. I had no idea how long this was going to last. No one really did. And I think at the beginning, we were like, okay, it's just like 2 weeks of lockdown. This is March of 2020. It's just 2 weeks of lockdown. Like maybe we should just cancel everything and then just like wait it out. Well, thank God we didn't do that because we would be like 14 months later. So pretty quickly we adapted, like changed our whole campaigns, cancel animal ag, which was kind of our, the hashtag cancel everything was trending. And we're like, well, yeah, we should cancel animal ag so this doesn't happen again and all of that. So yeah, it had a big impact on what we did, but overall, I feel pretty happy about how we've been able to adapt, and hopefully the world realizes we can't just go back to normal when we come out of this. Like we have to do something better and different so we don't find ourselves in the situation again.
Yeah, it's a really good answer. Does anyone have any questions? Anyone else in the?
Yeah, well, first off, thank you so much, Almira, for like explaining everything and also talking about like what DXC stands for and all of your goals and everything, and sharing your personal story on how you got involved. I was just a little bit curious because I know that we talked about this earlier, but I know that you used to work in a lab with lab animals, and I was wondering how or whether there's some sort of process where for researchers where they are desensitized to how difficult it might have been to sort of get into the animal rights movement after going through that type of training.
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I kind of failed to mention that in the trajectory between like my undergrad and grad school. I did another attempt at grad school in the middle there where I quit after 6 months because I was doing animal experimentation, and I already kind of felt bad about it, but like after 6 months, I was like, I can't do this at all anymore, and I quit. I think like for people who are probably more involved than like in the 6 months, there's a lot more kind of like deprogramming that needs to go into it. But I will say like they do really try to desensitize you and make you feel like you are just really doing the right thing. There's a lot of like in the lab, like there's all these posters on the wall that talk about like, look how like this disease would not have been cured if animals hadn't been tested on, and like, who do you care more about, a rat or a baby? You know, all that kind of stuff. That's just like, you're a hero for like doing this. And I'm sure that that's very intentional, so people don't feel bad about it. And then even just, and you see this in slaughterhouses too. There's actually a really good book called Every 12 Seconds by Timothy Patrat that talks about how even in slaughterhouses, the number of people that are actually involved in killing animals is so little that most people can kind of feel like, I'm just the person who unloads the cows. I'm just the person who like does, you know, removes the liver. Like, it's not me. I'm not the one who's doing it. And that's the same thing in the lab too. So when we would go to like do the experiment, the animals already there, they're already like anesthetized, like they're already unconscious. So you never see them when they're like being, you know, we were experimenting on pigs. You never see them as pigs. They're just like, oh, they're just unconscious on the table. Do your thing, you leave, and then there's someone else who's actually taking care of them after. So, and those people are like, well, I didn't do the experimentations. It's not on me. And we're like, oh, it's just like this unconscious pig. So it's not on us. And it's just really easy to just kind of feel like we're doing a good thing for society and it's not really hurting. Like, it's easy to kind of distance yourself from it. And it's also just very normalized. Like, there's not a talk, when we were talking about this project that we were working on, we were creating a medical device. There's not a conversation about, well, is there a way to do this without animals? It's just like the normal thing that academia is like slow to change, and it's just very kind of bureaucratic, and it's like, this is how things are done. And I think it would be very difficult to go in there and be like, let's just do it on some other like cell culture or something. You know, I know there's people working on that, but it is hard, I think, to get involved in some fields of research and avoid animal experimentation. So yeah, for people who are more involved in it, because I was like the bottom of a you know, some grad student, least experienced person in the lab, I was just like, I quit. The end, I'll just go work for a year while I figure out what I want to do. I think leaving is much more difficult, but I don't know of any specific resources, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I think that's super interesting. Yeah, especially because like, even for me, I'm a pre-med student, and even though after talking to doctors and from like in various different specific like sub-focuses, they're like, okay, in med school, you don't really focus heavily on testing on animals because you're trying to treat humans in your actual job. But we're still told in undergrad that like, okay, you know, you're supposed to do this dissection and you're supposed to do this experiment with animals because it's something that you're going to be asked to do later. And I feel like that advice sort of very much draws on the inability of undergrad students to actually contact doctors and to find out for themselves what's going on until they actually reach med school, at which point it's too late and they would have already done the experiments and they would have already done the dissections. And I think that there's this fragmentation of the process, like what you were describing in the research lab as well about, you know, they fragment the process so that each person does one subset of it and they don't see like the pig after the experiment. They don't see the pig before the experiment, for example, and you'll only do one part of it. And that sort of absolves you of any sort of responsibility or feeling like you are actually impacting the life of an animal who you're using. So I think that that's really interesting. But yeah, that was my question.
Anyone else have a question or any more questions?
I had a question. So me and Linnea yesterday were talking about how there's a stereotype of how vegans tend to act as extremists and how a lot of people took a step back from it, even though they care a lot about animals and they hate seeing the cruelty. My question is, what do you think would be the best approach for both types of people?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. One thing is, I think nonviolence is really important. Just even if you're not like morally convinced about nonviolence, like from a strategic perspective, there is a lot of evidence that shows like nonviolent movements are more successful than violent ones. So I think there's a need for extremists, but I put that in quotes as in like I wouldn't, not like advocating violence, but we need some people who are like out there doing the wild stuff that kind of normalizes everything. So a couple of concepts of that is like, you can kind of look up like the radical flank effect, which is essentially like these, like if you have a small group of people doing really radical things, then everyone else who's kind of like a little bit more radical, but not that radical, their position becomes a little bit more accepted. It's like, and the other concept that goes along with that is like shifting the Overton window. So the Overton window is this idea of like what's seen as acceptable in society. And if you have some extremists, you can shift that to be like, okay, we don't agree with those people, but we agree a little bit closer now. But that being said, I don't think, people have to find the activism that they feel most comfortable with. So my main point of advice on that before I really do need to go at 9:30 is that I think it's okay if you or anyone doesn't want to be like the extremist, but I think it's important that we recognize the role that that plays in the movements, and that even if like you don't like what someone else is doing, or like I don't like vegan outrage or whatever, that we understand that all of us are playing a role. And just because we don't do it doesn't mean we have to like shit on it on the internet. So yeah, but that's kind of what I would say about that. People have to find the activism that's not going to burn them out, but we should support people's activism unless it's like actually harmful. But yeah, sorry to end it super short, but I do need to go to another meeting.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and it was a pleasure talking to you. And it was really inspiring to hear your story. And
Yeah.
I hope that people watching this got inspired as well as we did.
All right.
So
well,
thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for joining, Almira.
Bye, thanks all.
Yeah.